Repeated again and again in these old manuals was the maxim, "A general should not say, 'I did not expect it.'" The general was expected to be intellectual, to be a strategic thinker, to be possessed by metis, and to, above all, secure victory through any means necessary, with battle being an absolute last resort. This is for a myriad of reasons, as we've discussed and as we will continue to discuss. In ancient Byzantine society, the army was not the first line of defense for the general. The general's mind was the first line of defense for the empire. It is important again to note that the Byzantines were constantly outnumbered. We're going to take a look at a single battle here in a minute to kind of prove some of these points, but the things that the Byzantines did have were their effective strategy, their foresight in the use of spies, in the use of deserters, in the use of foreign contacts, and their material. You may have heard of Damascus steel. This was one of the earliest forms of very high quality iron and steel produced products until the advent of Spanish steel several hundred years later, far to the west. And it enabled the soldiers and the craftsmen and artisans who made these sorts of things to produce very fine quality objects. A lot of the finest and most durable goods in the world between the 5th and 8th centuries AD were produced by the Byzantines. So even though they had all of these advantages, they usually didn't have the numbers to completely refill an army every time one of their generals decided to go looking for victory through bloodlust. So, if the officers embraced metis and the use of deception and tactics to defeat a foe rather than actual battle, the soldiers themselves, mostly illiterate unless they were trying to climb their way up the military ladder, would have been the embodiment of BA. An important side note before we go too far into this, the Byzantine military structure was very into the idea of individuals who were not noble, who were not royal, leading and fighting in their battles. They thought that a general who had come from a lowborn, from a farm, something like that, would have a lot more to gain from proper military than someone who was born with everything, who would likely just run away. This set the stage for some very interesting developments when various low-born soldiers would actually gain the favor of their men who fought specifically for them and again were soldiers and nothing else, since the military was extremely insulated from the citizens, and would use that power to displace a royal or a noble or even an emperor who was soft, weak, and seemed to care little about anything other than giving what the crowd wanted at that moment. We would see this time and time again with Justinian's uncle, with Leo III, the Isaurian, with the Macedonian dynasty, with all of these different people that would come up, that would use their intelligence and their ability to make a name for themselves that wouldn't have been available in just about any other society. So, back to metis and BA. The soldiers would often want battle because, again, this was their only occupation. And there was a fairly obvious dividing line between the officer and the soldier. The officer was literate, the soldier was not. The officer was not allowed to engage in battle and had to have his entire mind devoted to the strategic movements of his troops. The soldier was not allowed to think or do anything that wasn't specifically related to battle, and when they weren't battling, they were often given tasks just to keep them busy because their minds needed to be on this, not on something like insurrection, you know? This led to some very interesting splits between the soldiers and the officers, and often these soldiers would get upset at their officers for winning battles and even wars without engaging a single time. The soldiers themselves would feel cheated. They had lost their chance to bathe in the blood of their enemies, to meet the glory of battle, which they saw as their primary goal. But the commanders who were telling them what to do knew a little bit better than that, and there was several times where these two concepts came into conflict, and usually those possessed by BA, when they displaced those possessed by Metis, caused tragedy, to be honest. Maurice himself, who wrote the Strategicon, which a lot of this video is going to be based off of, was displaced by his soldiers because he was too frequently using stratagems and tactics and not giving to battle enough, and when he was replaced by his soldiers with another emperor, tragedy struck, and that emperor himself had to be replaced by someone we'll talk about eventually, Heraclius. So, what is a specific case of the BA of the soldier coming into conflict with the Metis of a general? Let's take a look at one campaign of Belisarius. We're going to have a whole series of videos dedicated to him eventually, but it's important to note these little parts that have to do more with the strategy of the Byzantines than the individual themselves. So Belisarius came back from the west, from Italy. He had been recalled to deal with a mighty Persian army that was marching up from Ctesiphon, and they were going to Antioch, one of the richest cities along the Mediterranean eastern coast, which was under Byzantine influence. And they had mustered something like 200,000 men for this trek, and they had to cross through a fierce desert where they crossed up through the Euphrates and then over to the coast, and then they were supposed to go back. But Belisarius did not want to engage in this army, mostly because we don't know exactly how many troops he had, but it was probably something like 18,000. So just the odds alone, 18,000, 200,000, not good. Each soldier is going to have to kill something like 12 guys by himself, which is not usually the kind of odds that you get in any battlefield scenario. So, what does Belisarius do? He finds a spot near the Euphrates along where the Persians are going to have to march on their way to Antioch. He lines his troops out as far as he can. He gets several different units to actually spread themselves out and to make fake camps. We're going to go further into how the Byzantines used deception, but these are all classic pieces of Byzantine deception during wartime, which was a staple of their actual warfare strategies. So Belisarius had his best and most able soldiers, his Hunnic mercenaries, and a couple others, actually stationed far enough out so that when the Persians finally noticed them as they were marching past them, they sent a delegation out. They had to speak to these big Huns who were very eager for battle. This, along with the long battle lines, the fake tents, the fires pitched everywhere, gave an impression of an army at least 10 times the size of what Belisarius actually had. The army had already gotten past the point of where Belisarius was pitched, however. So they decided to turn around and to leave because if Belisarius wheeled around to the back of the army, cut their supply lines, they were in the middle of a desert, it would go very poorly for them. Especially since a lot of these troops were Iranian, they weren't really used to the desert in between the Euphrates and the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. The army pulled back, retreated, decided it wasn't worth it, 200,000 men is a lot to lose, and decided to go back to Ctesiphon. Belisarius considered himself successful. He had pushed back the enemy incursion without losing a single soldier, and he had made terms with the Persians to separate for now and to have some sort of wartime armistice. They were working on a treaty when Belisarius' soldiers became very upset. They constantly perturbed him. They wanted their battle. They had been formed out here in the desert, far away from home. They did not want to go home with clean weapons, you could say. Belisarius was still a younger general, and this was when he made his biggest mistake of his career, and he gained the only loss that we know of that Belisarius ever accrued. He decided to allow his troops to attack the rear of the retreating enemy army. This came with a terrible loss. Many of his soldiers were slaughtered. The battle itself was a loss for the Byzantines. It was not only unnecessary in the idea of the battle didn't need to happen strategically, it was unnecessary in the loss of life and in the replenishment that would be needed for the Byzantine military over time. The Persian army was prolonged and in this desert for much longer than they thought they were going to be because of the retreat without the actual sacking of Antioch, and the several losses that they incurred encouraged them to continue to leave. So it was a Pyrrhic victory, even with the odds at over 10 or 20 times, but it still hammered home the idea that the concept of Bia, of the warrior's courage and spirit, was gone and had no place in the medieval battlefield of Byzantium. Now, just real quick, I want to explain a little bit about the generals themselves. They had to dress plainly, to eat plainly, to live plainly. They were to act in accordance with how they wanted their soldiers to act. They would frequently be required to change form and to change the way that they dress and present themselves depending on the situation, so that the enemy did not know who they were and made it harder for them to be assassinated. They had to not only plan out the events for the soldiers, they were also required to take part in physical labors, and whenever possible, as far away from enemies as humanly possible, if applicable, they were required to take part in constructions, in ditch digging, and all these things to show unity with their soldiers, so that they didn't appear to be so separate as in all reality they truly were. This was part of the Byzantine psychological warfare. Psychology was an integral part, it cannot be understated, of the Byzantine military strategy. The psychology of your own troops and their morale, and the psychology of the opposing troops and their morale. A couple maxims from the Strategicon for you. A deserted foe is better than a killed one. A deserted foe is demoralized and will likely not come back to fight, or at least doesn't have to be physically dealt with. A killed foe required someone to kill him, energy to be expended, a battle to happen. So psychology was an extremely important part, which we're going to take a look at again next part when we talk about the deception techniques. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. This is going to be a extensive, hopefully it's still going to be 3 parts, about the Byzantine strategy. I'm still kind of fleshing some of it out and trying to see where exactly it's going to go. This is one I have a lot of sources on. This was one that I was really looking forward to. The next couple parts are going to be a lot of fun. So if you enjoyed, make sure to like or to comment. Let me know what you did like, what you didn't like. If you want to see more like this, make sure to subscribe. And as always, remember, Ave Imperator.